So now we enter into the Zia period. Bhutto is overthrown. You know already he calls an early election, blah, blah, blah. I told you all that stuff. Zia comes to power. And here's where the irony is that, I'm sure, a lot of you were laughing when I was showing that video of Zia. And a lot of you would like the Ziaul Haq to not be, the Zia period, to not be economically successful and to be a bit of a flop. But the opposite is, in fact, the case. Zia ends up being the leader, the single individual that has led this country for the longest time period of any leader in Pakistan. And from Zia period onwards, you see that Pakistan moves back into the sort of old way of doing things, that is the Ayub way of doing things. It goes to the International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment policies, etc., begin in this period, and then continue from the Zia period all the way up to today. So the whole economic policy from this period onwards is mainly only dictated by the IMF. This is, of course, a return of high growth of rate, return of business confidence. Islamization is mainly used as a tool and a political weapon to make sure that the left kind of populism of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto does not come back to power. That's really the main aim. Akbar Noman calculates that that Pakistan's GDP grew by 6.5%. This is faster than Korea, China, Hong Kong. Only slower than Korea, China, Hong Kong. Those are the only countries going faster. And I remember this very well because although everybody, a lot of people hated Ziaul Haq, etc., but everybody was also making a lot of money in the Zia period. And, and you saw that. You saw these across Lahore, these new houses come up, etc. They were mostly white. We used to call them powder palaces. We used to call them powder palaces because we thought that they were financed by the sale of heroin, which always there was a huge trade going on between Afghanistan and Europe, etc., heroin trade, etc., etc. Naqvi and Sarmad calculate that the growth rates are up to 7% if you look at the period from 78 to 86. World Bank similarly estimates that manufacturing on its own grew by 9.5% between 77 and 86. Investment in middle and large-scale industry grew at 18.2%. Total private investment expanded at 15.6%. So I don't expect you to remember these numbers, but the numbers are important, at least to form a general picture that, look at the picture over here, for example. Manufacturing seems to be growing at this rate almost consistently from the 1950s. That's the picture I want you to see, right? Agriculture, not so much. It doesn't grow, and then it grows very rapidly, and then the growth tapers off. Form that picture, right? And what's happening with public and private investment? Most of the investment in the 70s is public investment, and then private investment returns in the 80s. What is happening to large-scale manufacturing? Sorry that this graph is not very clear, but you can see 78 to 88, it is growing at 10%. In the fifth plan period, it's growing at 12.8%. In the sixth plan period, it is growing at 9.9%. So basically speaking, these are the different industries that come under manufacturing: beverages, tobacco, textile, food, apparel, leather, footwear, ginning and processing, etc., woodworks, furniture, paper, printing, drugs, legal ones, chemicals, petroleum, rubber, plastic, pottery, glass, etc., etc., all of these different categories. So between 76 and 86, the share of wages and salaries and values actually fell. Pakistan is becoming more capital intensive from almost 27 to 20%. The share of what's going to the working class is falling. And of course, for a while, public sector continues to dominate, and in fact even shows a very high rate of growth. And the reason is that the investments made in the Bhutto period actually begin to pay dividends in the Zia period. So he got quite lucky there as well. And that was why also Zia did not want to privatize a lot of the public industry in the very beginning. But the problem with this kind of growth, the Zia growth, is that TFP is not growing. Remember TFP from before? As much as 82% of the overall growth was due to growth in capital stock, 14.5% to labor, and only 3.17% TFP growth. It was almost 5% before we calculated, right? This is again Asad Said. So what that means is that you have a lot more money, but you're not spending it on getting better technology. That's basically what it means. You're using the same technology, just using it more. So Zia's industrial policy was to restore business confidence, and he did that via his idea of Islamization. Basically, Islamization was used against the social democratic ideas of Bhutto. And Anita Weiss, for example, also points out that this is not a substantive departure from capitalist policies. The major difference is only in riba and in interest rates, where Islamic banking system is introduced. And all the Islamic banking system does is basically it suggests that the bank is sharing in the profit and loss of the business to which it is making the loan. But of course, the bank is always sharing in the profit and loss in the business in which it's making a loan, because if they don't pay back the loan, then the bank obviously has to liquidate, or that particular person has, the assets of that person, the collateral of that person has to be liquidated, and the bank will not make that extra money from that loan that it's made, and therefore, will not be able to pay its depositors as much money as it would be able to pay them if it's making more money. Right? If you have a lot of money, what do you invest it in? This is the essential economic question, right? You can invest it in doing the same thing that you were doing before, except you do more of it. For example, let's say I was making shoes. Take it? And how was I making shoes? I was making shoes by getting lots of karigars, and they had their own peti and their own tools, and they were making those shoes, right? And now I have more money. And what do? I had 100 karigars. Now I have 500 karigars, right? They're still making the same shoes. They're still using the same technology to make the same shoes. They're still making shoes at the same speed. It's still, the shoes that are being made still cost me the same per shoe that's made. If it cost me 100 rupees to make a shoe, it's still costing 100 rupees to make that shoe. What is the TFP result? 0. I have not changed the technology at all. The growth has been only a result of the extension of capital and labor, rather than a result in the in higher productivity. Now let's say I take that money and instead of getting more workers, I get better machines. Now suddenly I'm able to produce more shoes at 50 rupees. I'm using less labor per dollar that I'm investing, or per rupee that I'm investing. The output that I'm getting is actually much higher now. Now my TFP is going to go up. So how does he restore business confidence? Tax holidays, export rebates are reinstituted, low interest rates are kept very, very low. And interestingly, Ziaul Haq comes back to creating the 5-year plan, the 5th and the 6th 5-year plan. Now here's the biggest irony. I find it very ironic that the Prime Minister who was socialist actually never managed to implement the economic plan that they created. And the reason was, of course, OPEC. OPEC really threw the economic plan completely out of the window. There was no question of sticking to that economic plan. And the government that was more pro-market government was actually, ended up doing the planning rather than the pro-socialist government. So that's a unique irony of history. By the way, we have always had economic planning. Unlike, free market, what free marketers will tell you, had it not been for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth economic plan, the industrialization that you saw under Pickett and, PI, FDC, etc., and PIFCO, and etc., none of that could have taken off. It was always driven via the state. It was a state-led sort of form of free market enterprise. That's why also it was very, very highly monopolized. So he came and he denationalized the agro-based industries, rice husking, flour milling, and cotton ginning, etc., and also some smaller cement and engineering units, and then later some heavy chemical and cement units. But overall, actually in the Zia period, there was very little privatization. Overall, Zia did not privatize the economy. And what were the reasons for that? One was he could see, and economists could tell him, look, these industries are actually going to make money. The investment that Bhutto has done is actually going to make you money, so don't privatize. They already had running contracts, so privatizing in the middle of a contract could have a problem. And last but certainly not least, had he gone for large-scale privatization, with the popularity of Bhutto, the labor movement would have come out in hundreds of thousands. And at that time, in Pakistan, the labor movement was an incredibly strong movement. They could fill up the Mall Road with red flags. In a day's notice, they could jam up railways. If Mirza Ibrahim said tomorrow there will be a Payya Jam Hartal, thak, all of Pakistan would come to a close. Very, very strong labor movement. Today, the labor movement isn't even a shadow of its former self. But if I ever show you the statistics of labor days lost, for example, or strikes in Pakistan, you will see they rise up, and in the 1970s they go all the way up. And then Zia comes along and boom, they go all the way back down to almost zero. Because now he's smashing the trade unions. But he does not want to give the trade unions any, and also the student unions, but he doesn't want to give them any pretext by doing something in which the entire body of workers will come out because they think it's going to be privatized. So he doesn't privatize. And he doesn't need to either. Let's look at public sector investment. In 78, 72%, 65, 58, 52, 48. Slowly, by the time Zia's regime comes to an end, it climbs down very slowly, tapering off from 72% all the way down to under 18%. So slow decline that you can see over here. Back to the Ayub sort of model of development. By the sixth five-year plan in 1983, the IMF is now promoting the idea of deregulation as well as liberalization. And the reason why this is going on is because in South Korea, as well as in Thailand and Taiwan, and these countries are being referred to as the Asian tigers. And the strategy of the Asian tigers was not protectionism, but was what was called export-oriented growth or export-oriented industrialization. And so Pakistan wants to copy basically the Taiwanese model and create a growth pattern which is highly export-oriented. So rather than creating tariffs and barriers and protectionism, they are doing the reverse. They're trying to liberalize and deregulate. So this is the period also in which the fixed exchange rate is broken, and for the first time you get a managed float of the currency. That means you can buy currency, as in when I was a kid you couldn't buy currency. When I was a kid, what you had to do in order to get dollars was you went to a government office, you showed the visa that you had, the purpose why you had that visa, and then you applied to get dollars. And for every visit, you could get, like, for example, if you were a tourist, you could get this many dollars. If you were going on business, you could get this. If you're doing this, conference, whatever. Every category of visa had a set category of the number of dollars you could buy. So that's how the government at that time controlled the exchange rate, that you just couldn't buy dollars any other way. Today, the world has completely transformed. There's no country, there are countries in the world that continue to do that. North Korea, for example, and many other countries as well. But most countries in the world have moved over to this particular system, which is a managed float. In a managed float, any consumer can go and buy any currency they want to, provided it's available in the open market. And the government tries to also buy and sell the same currency in order to manage the exchange rate within a certain framework. Now, any government can only manage to keep the exchange rate within a certain bandwidth if it has in its possession a lot of foreign exchange reserves. Because it will have to take its dollars and buy up rupees in case if the rupee is falling, it has to take its dollars and buy up rupees from the open market so that the demand for rupees goes up and the rupee goes back up. The only government that really manages to do that really quite well is the Chinese government, which has massive foreign exchange reserves. We don't. In fact, we have the opposite problem. We rarely have foreign exchange reserves, which is why the currency is really never in our control, and boom, it escalates anytime there's any sort of problem. So that was in 1982. The economists at the time argued that such a system would boost our exports, because economists always argue, more or less, to devalue the currency, to boost exports. They'll be cheaper. But the result of that, I think you can also see that imports are also more expensive, and when imports are more expensive, you can wipe out oil. You have to import oil, you have to import petroleum, and that can cause inflation and high interest, the rise in the cost of living, etc., etc. Another good luck factor for Ziaul Haq was that remittances peaked in 1982. They were started by Bhutto, but he didn't really get to reap the money that came in from them. You can see they go on a ramp, and by 1982-83, remittances are a major source of income. Then they declined somewhat, But by 2001, boom, look at that, expands. That's fantastic, right? They go back up. What happens here that causes this massive jump? 9/11 Musharraf, yes. All right, so much of the Zia economy is driven, as the Ayub economy was driven by Sito and Sento and by the massive aid and assistance that he got, the Zia economy is really driven by the Afghan jihad. Loads and loads of money is coming into Pakistan as a consequence of the jihad. And it's not just coming in from the United States of America, it's also coming in from the Muslim world, which is now very rich. It's coming in from Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries to fight this jihad. It's also coming in from England and France, etc., and other Western countries, because they want to see the Soviet Union defeated, etc. So here's a comparison of the foreign aid received by both governments. So Bhutto got $871 million. Zia got $1.45 billion per year. And that went up all the way to, I think, 2.5 or something, $2.4 billion a year. So massive amounts of foreign aid coming in. After the Zia period is over, you get into the 90s, and you have these new policies which are called structural adjustment policies, which basically is SAP. I like to say that they sapped Pakistan's economy, right? The IMF really sapped Pakistan's economy. So what happened? What were these policies? Well, they proposed an increase in the level of indirect taxes in the form of a generalized sales tax. This has been going on, folks, for the last 30 years. Sales tax lagao, sales tax lagao, sales tax lagao, right? Withdrawal of subsidies on gas, electricity, telephones, and fertilizer. Increase in producer prices of major crops and in the prices of petroleum products. 12.5% reduction in the public sector development program during the agreement, but basically reduce the public sector. Privatize it where necessary. Restriction on government borrowing and credit allocation on the private sector. So these were, in a nutshell, SAP policies. SAP policies were markets work better than governments do, the state does. Let the markets do their job, take away the state. What's happening in the world at this time is a revolution or a counter-revolution in economics, right? Across the world, IMF goes to over 100 countries in the world and gives them a one-size-fits-all policy. Do this and your economy will do better. Privatize, deregulate, liberalize, by which of course is meant, take away the tariffs, take away the barriers, take away the protectionism, all of this stuff. This is all outdated stuff. Trade internationally, let the domestic industries compete at the international level, see what happens. So what did happen? Well, as I said, we were sapped. Here is the sectoral contribution to GDP. You see agriculture, manufacturing, construction, etc., and everything together. And what happens to the average? We go from 6.5 to 4.79 to 4.6 to 5.5 to 6.3 to 5.3. You see a slow decline. And this is right now only till 88, 92, where the SAP policies are only just beginning to take off. As you continue to go forward, you see that industry essentially undergoes a decline. Here's what the World Bank said way back, I think somewhere in the 90s. They said industrial value added grew by 6.3%. This is low compared to what Pakistan was doing before, where we could easily hit 10% before. We used to go above 10% many times. Manufacturing, electricity, and water, which explains most, 86% of this favorable result. These are the only three industries that continue to sort of really develop. And electricity mainly because we had IPP coming in and investing in Pakistan, etc. A large investment in the energy sector led to significant increases in all major energy sources during this period. Crude oil did this. But the interesting thing is the strong performance of small-scale manufacturing, which accounts for about 1/3 of the total manufacturing value added, and non-traditional large-scale industries is encouraging. So World Bank saw that the large-scale sector, which we had been encouraging before, is no longer doing its job, and it's being taken over by services in the small scale and middle scale sector. So SAP really is a transformation, represents a big transformation from a growth model that emphasized big industry to a growth model that began to emphasize small and middle scale industry. Was this deliberate, or did it just flow out of the results of SAP? That is a debate I think that we will try to have in the next class. So SAP results, 1990s we declined, our growth rate declined to 4.8% over that decade. And once again, when you had democracy, you had slow growth rates, what did everybody begin to say? Democracy is a flop. But the real reason is not democracy, it has to do with structural adjustment policies. That's the real reason. It has to do with economic policy. And economic policy, Benazir and Nawaz Sharif fought each other like crazy in the 1990s. They overthrew each other's governments like crazy. Yet, when it comes to economic policy, their policies were nearly identical. There is really no difference between their economic policies of PPP or PMLN or PTI or Musharraf. We've been running on the same economic policies for the last 30 or maybe 40 odd years. Okay. Yes, it's the last slide. Don't worry. Well, that the whole Washington, it's part of the whole Washington consensus. The Washington consensus was that why was the IMF created in the first place? Let's go back into history, right? The IMF was created when the 1930s stock market nearly put the whole of global capitalism in risk of being overthrown by communists. Put it really straightforwardly to you. That's what they were terrified of. They were terrified that if we have another recession like the 1928-29 stock market crash and then a recession that followed, the communists are going to take over. To give you just one example, on the months that followed the stock market crash in the US, 100,000 workers became members of the Communist Party of USA as a consequence of, in a matter of a couple of months. Itni rapid transformation. So they thought this is going to be the death of us. So we got to do something, we got to manage it. So one way to manage that, of course, was the New Deal that Roosevelt came up with. The other way was what Keynes suggested. Keynes was a very smart guy. He understood that if you leave the market to its own devices, you are going to have these big swings in output, etc. You're going to have massive, massive swings. You just cannot avoid it. And if you have another massive swing like this, then it's bye-bye capitalism. So to make sure that capitalism doesn't do this, up and down, you have to smooth it out. And the only way you can smooth it out is by bringing in the state sector in a huge and big way. Bring in the state sector, because when the market goes down, the state sector will jump in, buy stuff, invest in stuff, create stuff, pulling the economy back up again. It will pull up aggregate demand again, right? And then when we are in a really good period, then you can tax people and so on and so forth, take money away from them. And then when you go into recession, pull it up. Make the state pull up the market.